If aliens landed on Earth and all they were interested in was football, we'd have to nominate a club that encapsulated the sport to our new extra-terrestrial buddies. If we were to do so, there's no better candidate than Real Madrid. They're the most successful Champions League team. They've got domestic honours in La Liga and the Copa del Rey coming out of their ears, and they're a global brand that is only ceilinged by our inability to play the sport in other galaxies. They've produced innumerable world-class teams, and before we kick off today, I want you to think of one in particular. Is it the Galacticos or the three-peat team of Zidane? Is it the team that won the first 5 European Cups? They're certainly the headline teams of this great club. In today's film, however, we're going to give some love to a lesser heralded team, the Vulture Squad, La Quinta del Buitre, led by Emilio Butragueno, that ran rampant in the 80s. On May 31st, 1961, in Bern, Switzerland, Bela Gutmann had blown European football wide open as his Benfica team romped to the European Cup trophy. After 5 years of Real Madrid rule, the Portuguese club's 3-2 win over Barcelona had finally ended a continental monopoly. If that wasn't rubber-stamped enough, Gutmann and Benfica did it again 12 months later, but this time against Real Madrid. The peak of Real Madrid's empire was Hampden Park in 1960. It was Eintracht Frankfurt, and it was a 7-3 victory that echoed through the ages. That empire was now demolished. Europe had a new master, football was changing, and only after 3 years of Milanese magic did Real Madrid return to win a 6th continental crown. The end was already here, and the wait for a 7th European Cup would be much longer than 6 years. Only fullback Pachin and winger Paco Gento remained from the 1960 final to win Real Madrid's 6th European Cup against Partizan Belgrade, but it was already too late. The year before, Rinus Michels took charge of Ajax and had won the Eredivisie, paving the way for total football to sweep through Europe. Still prevalent was the British pragmatism of Jock Stein and Matt Busby, and so too the afterglow of Milan's prominence under Nereo Rocco at the turn of the decade. Meanwhile, Real Madrid were busy being dumped out of earlier stages thanks to Rapid Vienna and Standard Liège. Their dissension from the top of the Spanish mountain led them to campaigns in the Cup Winners' Cup and UEFA Cup, which proved just as fruitless. By the time Real returned to the competition they belonged in 1972, the landscape had been drastically altered by the Dutch. Upon their return to the semi-finals of the competition they used to own, Los Blancos found out firsthand just how much football had changed. This was the era of Johan Cruyff and Ajax, winners of the previous 2 European Cups, and on course to become the only team since Real's supremacy in the 50s to win 3 on the spin. A 2-1 defeat away from home in those days was viewed almost as good as a victory. Yet Ajax levelled up the away goal stakes back in the Bernabeu, put Juventus to the sword in the final and completed their trilogy. It would be 3 years before Real would be back in the competition. Whilst they avoided exciting outfits such as Valery Lobanovsky's Dynamo Kiev or the rampant Saint-Étienne, coached by Robert Herban, the European Cup was a far deeper affair come the mid-70s. They had to navigate a 4-goal turnaround against English champions Derby County before one of the more hellacious quarter-finals against a Borussia Mönchengladbach team that could have feasibly staked a claim to being the best European team of their day. Yet it was another West German team who had gained a knack on the continent, much like Ajax had done, much like the great Real Madrid had previously done. And Real met them in the semi-finals, the great Bayern Munich of Meyer, Beckenbauer and Müller. It was another team that were on course for 3 European titles in a row. It was almost as if the European Cup were periodically feeding Los Blancos the sequels to their own success. Bayern, just as Ajax, obliged in showing Real Madrid how football in a new age worked by grabbing an away goal in Madrid before Gerd Müller scored 2 more back in Munich before a 3rd continental crown was confirmed. Johan Cruyff had even ventured into Spanish football, but thankfully for Real Madrid, his and Rinus Michels' Barcelona team were unable to create a monopoly over the country as they had done in the Netherlands. In Catalonia, they must have salivated as the combination of Cruyff's arrival and the deaths of General Franco and Santiago Bernabeu happened almost concurrently. Yet Real Madrid maintained their success domestically. It never did translate onto the European stage, however. A Xavier Club Brugge outfit, who were soon to reach the European Cup final, comprehensively eliminated Real Madrid at a last 16 stage. 2 years later, it was the turn of Grasshoppers Zurich, who overturned a 2-goal deficit to dispose of Los Blancos at the same stage. There was the very real possibility that the team of Juanito and Santillana were to fizzle out. Yes, they had collaborated on 3 successive La Liga titles, as well as a domestic double in 1980, but at the Bernabeu, they needed more. They craved that 7th European Cup. In 1981, it looked all set for Real Madrid to finally quench that thirst. Then again, Los Blancos fans must have believed that the prior year, Real had finally gotten beyond the earlier stumbling blocks, and after a stunning quarter-final comeback against former winners Celtic, they had a semi-final penciled in for the spring. They defeated their opponents 2-0 in the first leg at the Bernabeu. Everything seemed set in stone. With a plucky team governed by Brian Clough in Nottingham Forest and an Ajax team not of the 70s vintage, Real Madrid were favourites. Hamburger SV, however, had other ideas. This was a team that had designs on the European Cup of their own, and within one half of football had swept home 4 goals at the Volkspark Stadion. One more in the second half confirmed the West German spot in the European Cup final, not Real Madrid's. The following year, everything went similarly to plan. They'd peeked behind the Iron Curtain and vanquished a pair of challengers in Honvéd and Spartak Moscow. They'd won a semi-final first leg 2-0 once again. Thankfully, in Inter and Real found a team that were incapable of producing a second leg fight back, and Real were booked in for the final in Paris. Once again, they found themselves up against a mode of thinking that was more prevalent than theirs, that had been more successful than they could ever hope to be. In the early 70s, it was Ajax and total football that showed Real Madrid the errors of their ways. In the mid-70s, it was Bayern Munich and their own efficient form of total football that attempted to teach Real Madrid the same lessons. And now in 1981, it was English pragmatism and another team looking for a 3rd European Cup in quick succession. Liverpool, after a 2-year detour to Nottingham, were back in the saddle and, via Alan Kennedy, won their 3rd Continental title just as Ajax and Bayern had done. All 3 had beaten the team known as the Kings of Europe. It wasn't even as if Real Madrid had just faltered in the European Cup. They had been embarrassed not only in UEFA's premier competition, but also in the UEFA Cup and in the Cup Winners' Cup. After missing out on the Cup Winners' Cup after a replay defeat to Chelsea, Real limped through the continent in the 70s. First, it was a second-round loss to PSV Eindhoven, then a first-round elimination at the hands of Ipswich Town. Not satisfied with suffering humiliation in one competition, Real graduated to a penalty shootout defeat at the hands of Red Star Belgrade in a Cup Winners' Cup quarter-final in 1975, before returning to the UEFA Cup after losing the European Cup final in 1981. They struggled to knock down doors of far lesser teams from Hungary, East Germany and Austria before meeting their match in the quarter-final. A 3-1 win over Kaiserslautern in the home first leg ought to have been enough. Yet the West Germans eviscerated Real 5-0 back in Kaiserslautern. It was abject misery, but the winning of the Copa del Rey against Sporting Gijón demanded that they be funneled into the Cup Winners' Cup. In a time where the Basque Country ruled over Spain in the guise of a brutish athletic club as well as Real Sociedad, Los Blancos were effectively barred from the European Cup until further notice. If Real Madrid were busying ruining the decade known as the 80s, then 1983 was an exercise in scraping the bottom of the barrel. But it needn't have been so bad for Real Madrid. They were still blessed with Juanito and Santillana, and the decade kicked off with a quirky anomaly. The 1980 Copa del Rey final was contested by not just one Real Madrid, but two Real Madrids. That sounds insane, but when factoring in the Castilla youth team's mazy route to the final that took in the Basque challengers of Athletic and Real Sociedad's senior teams in the latter stages, they ultimately deserved their spot in the final. And whilst the senior team romped to a 6-1 triumph, Castilla would ultimately make their bow in the Cup Winners' Cup, thanks to Real's winning of the league title. They took West Ham to extra time in the first round, albeit in defeat, yet big things were still expected of the youth team. Unfortunately, despite all the promise, it fizzled out relatively quickly. Until 3 years later, Real Madrid had another youth team to be proud of. Maybe they didn't perform heroics in the Copa del Rey or go on a bizarre European adventure, but this team was inarguably better. This was a year where Real Madrid thought they could sink no lower. They'd missed out on the league yet again in excruciating circumstances. Real Madrid legend Alfredo Di Stefano, now coach of Valencia, masterminded a 1-0 win at the Mestalla that ripped La Liga from Real and handed it to Athletic Club by a single point on the final day. If that wasn't bad enough, then 10 days later Real Madrid suffered the indignity of another European final defeat, this time to Alex Ferguson and his Aberdeen side in Gothenburg. Real Madrid proved they weren't satisfied with that level of misery. They wanted to sink deeper into the mire. They wanted the ultimate year of defeat. So they trotted over to Zaragoza and not only lost the Copa del Rey final, they lost it in the final minute. Not only did they lose it in the final minute, but they lost it to Barcelona of all teams. There was a way to right this wrong, however. There was an opportunity later that month for Real to claim scant consolation from the season when they contested the final of the short-lived Copa de la Liga. They drew the final's first leg before losing the second, 2-1. The team who defeated them? Of course, it was Barcelona yet again. And after losing the Supercopa the December prior, after extra time to reigning league champions Real Sociedad, it was feasibly the most heartbreaking year on Real Madrid record. They could have walked away with 5 trophies. Instead, they walked away with nothing. Except they didn't. 1983 wasn't the year of doom and gloom for Real Madrid supporters that it should have been. 1983 was the beginning of something special. La Quinta del Buitre, they called them. Real Madrid's Castilla team, containing graduates from the famed La Fábrica Academy system, was gaining headlines nationwide. In a world where both Athletic Club and Real Sociedad strictly adhered to a policy of only fielding players from Basque, it made sense that not only their senior teams but their youth teams contained an incredible amount of quality. Yet Real Madrid's own youth stars proved the most successful. Led by Emilio Butragueno, nicknamed the Vulture, which the squad's moniker was named after, Castilla's games became the antidote for a bedraggled fan base that had grown sick and tired of the senior team's travails at home and on the continent. Youth team matches were moved to the Bernabeu. Such was the demand to see a more positive, youthful brand of football. In that respect, Castilla played their part, and they satisfied the hunger that Real Madrid supporters had developed over a lean spell. By the end of 1983, the fate of many Castilla players was sealed as they coped with not only Bilbao Athletic, one of the better youth teams of the time, but also with the mass of people inside the Bernabeu. 63,000 Madridistas filled out the Bernabeu to watch a 4-1 thrashing carried out by Castilla. Coached by Amancio, a winner of the 1966 European Cup with the senior side, Castilla wound up becoming the champions of the second division. In doing so, they become the first B team to win a league title, much less the second tier. Of course, Castilla could never carry out their promise of playing in La Liga, but the majority of players housed within would make the leap. The first to graduate to the senior side was not the star of the youth team, Emilio Butragueno, but instead Manolo Sanchez and Martin Vázquez. 2 months after their debuts, however, Butragueno got his bow. It proved one of the landmark moments in his career. Trailing to Cadiz by 2 goals, El Buitre took to the field at half-time and proceeded to score 2 goals and assist a third, completing a manic comeback. From then on in, he had to play. By the end of the 1983-84 season, as Castilla were busy wrapping up the Segunda, its youth team stars were trotting out occasionally for the senior team. All of La Quinta had turned out for the senior team come the end of the campaign. All would become immortalized at the club, yet one only does so in the team's slipstream. Miguel Pardeza finally made his loan move to Real Zaragoza permanent in 1987. Although he is often cited as one of the 5 Cantera players in the Vulture Squad, he only played 28 league games for Los Blancos and, thematically, doesn't neatly fit into the squad since he was the only one of the 5 not to be born in Madrid. Ultimately, earlier stars such as Juanito and Santillana, as well as goal scorers Hugo Sanchez and Jorge Valdano, are now seen as more synonymous with the real team of this time. Emilio Butragueno was named the Vulture because of his scavenging qualities in attack. Manolo Sanchez stated that all of the graduates shared the same philosophy on football, and that was to be bold and attacking. He even went as far to say that this style of football was the product of a Spanish society that desired change. This was a country less than a decade removed from the rule of General Franco and was still in the infancy of democracy. They'd watched several institutions try and drag Spanish football into the democratic age. Barcelona had tried to become the hip club of the time, signing players like Johan Cruyff and Johan Neeskens, as well as Rinus Michels, but their success only extended to one La Liga title, and the only title they claimed on the continent was the Cup Winners' Cup in 1979. Then Real had watched the Basque clubs dominate and tried to follow a similar in-house method by equipping the team with Alfredo Di Stefano from the dugout. Unfortunately, he couldn't yield the same success on the sidelines as he did on the pitch, so when La Quinta began to be reformed in the senior team, Real were on their longest La Liga drought since the arrival of Di Stefano as a player in 1953. After another dismal exit in the first round of the UEFA Cup against Sparta Prague, as well as another failure to win La Liga, Real Madrid were invigorated to go the distance again in Europe. As much as Di Stefano had attempted to bleed the youngsters into the senior team, his team was deemed up in the summer of 1984, replaced by the very same youth coach Amancio, who had awoken the Castilla team. Unfortunately, Amancio wouldn't bear the fruits of his work and realized the cut-and-thrust nature of senior football from the very first La Liga match. His real team were resoundingly beaten by Terry Venable's Barcelona, and always trying to catch their rivals up, finished a limp 5th as the affectionately known El Tel claimed La Liga and entry into the 1985-86 season of the European Cup. Amancio wouldn't see out the year thanks to their horrific start to 1985, which captured another defeat to Barcelona, as well as home losses to Sevilla and Real Zaragoza inside of a 9-match winless run. The domestic woes, both in Liga and Copa, had been offset by travails on the continent. Los Blancos also netted the Copa de la Liga with a 4-2 aggregate win over Atletico in the summer of 1985, with a tried and tested method of losing the away leg before winning the home leg. Here within lies the phenomena known as the spirit of Juanito. After gently easing to a first-round qualification thanks to only a 2-0 defeat in Innsbruck, Real Madrid chose chaos. First, they lost 3-1 in Rijeka, then they went one better by taking a 3-goal deficit against a much better Anderlecht. Real won both ties before tightening things up in the quarter-final in a 1-0 aggregate triumph over reigning champions Tottenham Hotspur. Between legs of the semi-final with Inter, however, Amancio was relieved of his duties and former player Luis Maloney stepped in as replacement, partly because of their poor form and partly because their continental participation was teetering like never before. Liam Brady and Alessandro Altobelli scored the goals in a 2-0 Inter win in the San Siro. They'd overcome deficits like this before, but not at this stage, and not against such a grand team. Regardless, the maxim of 90 minutes being a long time in the Bernabeu was born, and goals from Santillana and Michel overturned yet another deficit. That wouldn't be needed in the final, as Real romped to a 3-goal win in Hungary against Videoton before limiting damage back home in a 1-0 second-leg defeat. It was Real's first European trophy for a generation. Not since the 1966 European Cup final had they seen success on the continent. Their 5th place demanded a return to the competition for the successive season. The key to their success that year was inarguably Hugo Sanchez. His single-mindedness in front of goal not only led to a reoccurrence of Real's success in Europe, but he helped team that with a return to glory back home. Sanchez had won the Pichichi Trophy with bitter rivals Atletico Madrid the prior season. It was the Mexicans' impact that almost doubled their return in La Liga from 5th place, and 46 goals scored in 1984, 85 to a championship, and 83 goals in 1985-86. Not only did they win the league, Sanchez won another Pichichi Trophy thanks to 22 goals, and Real demolished the league. 11 points is a strong enough advantage nowadays, but this, in a world of 2 points for a win, was complete humiliation. They'd only lost twice whilst the title was still up for grabs, both in November, and had taken to the UEFA Cup with the same reckless abandon they had done the prior year, safe in the knowledge that they needn't return. Los Blancos started as they concluded the prior campaign with a 1-0 loss, this time to AEK Athens in a first-round first leg. Of course, that was overturned, as were defeats that ought to have been prohibitive in a 5-1 last 16 loss to Borussia Mönchengladbach and another 2-goal defeat to Inter in a semi-final. Jorge Valdano and Santillana's doubles swore off Gladbach on away goals, just as Santillana repeated the trick in a 5-1 thrashing of Inter at the Bernabeu. Sandwiched in between, they simply had to ride the crest of the wave of defeat. 3-0 up and seemingly coasting into the semi-final, Real chucked in a 2-goal defeat in Switzerland to Neuchâtel Xamax, which nearly cost them. Ultimately, Real weathered the storm, and once Inter were beaten, FC Köln were vanquished in the final, following a similar pattern to the previous year. In the first leg, they were too strong, humiliating Köln 5-1, but only after going behind early on in the Bernabeu. Then, they eased up to a defeat that wasn't prohibitive to the defending of the UEFA Cup for the first time in competition history. It was almost as if Real Madrid couldn't bring about success without placing a mountain in front of themselves. While scalable in the lesser UEFA Cup, the European Cup would be much more difficult. Even in contrast, La Liga had become a walk in the park. Hugo Sanchez followed up his debut season's Pichichi with 3 more in 4 years, as Real waltzed to the title in each season. 3 points the deficit in 1987 from Barcelona. Before that gaping chasm stretched back out to 11 points by 1988. That was from Real Sociedad, however, with Barcelona a drastic 23 points back in 6th place. But it was a mammoth domestic success that Real Madrid players didn't feel all that bothered about celebrating. It wasn't that the winning of a 3rd La Liga title in succession had made the players blasé of domestic success. It was the travails on the continent that did that. La Quinta del Buitre had been known for their artistic adolescence, but with Hugo Sanchez's ruthlessness, they had matured into the complete article. With the European Cup now afforded to them, Real Madrid were due to conquer the continent once again. It started well, with more than a sprinkling of Real's old UEFA Cup habits. First, they were beaten by young boys, only to humiliate them back in the Bernabeu. Then they lost by 2 in Belgrade, only to squeeze out of that bind with an away goals triumph back in Madrid. The only time the legs were reversed, in the quarter-final in between, Real Madrid escaped with a penalty shootout win against the dangerous Juventus. Come the semi-finals, though, after conquering such teams and with either Porto or Dinamo Kyiv awaiting in a potential final, Real's campaign came unravelled. A pair of Lothar Matthaus penalties saw to a 4-1 defeat against Bayern Munich in West Germany. Real fans attempted to disrupt Bayern in any way imaginable in the second leg, but it only served to dispel the spirit of Juanito, as only a 1-0 win could be gained. For a first campaign back, it was deemed acceptable, if a little disappointing, and they knew they would have to exceed those expectations the following season. Through hell or high water, Real looked as though they had scaled the enormous teams that were all housed in the same half of the draw. They couldn't have asked for a harder start to the draw, handed Diego Maradona's Napoli. Thankfully, a Michel penalty and an own goal kept the Italians quiet before Emilio Butragueno's away goal in Naples confirmed progression. Then it was the reigning champions Porto who took an early lead in the Bernabeu, only for the spirit of Juanito to rear its head inside of one fixture when Hugo Sanchez and Manolo Sanchez combined for 2 goals in the final 10 minutes. A similar double in Portugal, this time solely from Michel, confirmed a rare 2-victory win for Real on the continent. The quarter-finals gave Real an opportunity at revenge when they met Bayern Munich. It seemed ordained to follow the same path as the prior year's semi-final, when the West Germans raced into a 3-goal lead. This time, Real showed a spot of resolve when Butragueno and Sanchez converged on 2 away goals in the final 5 minutes. Now, it seemed like name on the trophy stuff, especially once Real got Bayern back to the Bernabeu and overturned the 1-goal deficit. They were faced with Guus Hiddink's PSV and not the 1986 Barcelona conquerors Steaua Bucharest in the next phase. They went ahead in the Bernabeu first leg, only to be held by PSV. If a little irritating, Real were still expected to complete the victory in Eindhoven. But then PSV did exactly what this vintage of PSV did best. They sat off, they defended, and most of all, they got extremely lucky. They had goalkeeper Hans van Breukelen to thank for keeping a miraculous clean sheet amidst all kinds of adversity. By some accounts, the goalkeeper stopped 10 shots on target. Real weren't the only ones frustrated by the Dutch team. Hiddink had pulled the same trick on the Spaniards as they had done to Bordeaux a round earlier, that is, snatch an away goal before a cunning stalemate at home. This also transpired in the final, as PSV relied on penalties after another stalemate to seal the unlikeliest of European Cup triumphs after failing to win their final 5 matches. That fact makes it even more gut-wrenching for Real Madrid, their players and supporters. To do everything right, by first beating the real contenders, then by performing to an incredible level against the undeserving eventual champions, it felt like they were never going to win it. Spain had been brought up on La Furia. Leo Benhacker had been brought up on a Dutch creativity. The two were bound by one thing: failure. Whilst Real Madrid's vintage under the Dutchman had sought to team creativity with a hard-nosed brand of success, then shunned the Spanish tradition of defeat. Unfortunately for Los Blancos, the cogs inside another Dutchman were turning to create just that, only somewhere else. "1988 was the year Johan Cruyff returned to Spain. His first year wasn't the fairy tale he had dreamt up, as Barcelona were cast aside both in the title race by the Vulture Squad and in the Copa del Rey in a violent 4-0 loss by Atletico Madrid. His one solace was the Cup Winners' Cup in a prophetic triumph over Sampdoria. When Leo Benhacker suffered for his dropping of golden boy Emilio Butragueno, John Toshak picked up the ball and ran with it. In the opinion of Hugo Sanchez, who scored 38 goals in La Liga that season, Toshak built the best version of the Vulture Squad. The deficit was 9 points from Valencia and 107 goals were scored. For all that prolonged, relentless success, the 5th title in a row wasn't enough. On April 5th, 1990, Real Madrid had a chance to kill off Johan Cruyff in Spanish football for good. Instead, they left the door open and paid the price. Cruyff's job as Barcelona manager hinged entirely on the result of the 1990 Copa del Rey final. They'd failed to retain their Cup Winners' Cup crown, lost the Super Cup, and it was an open secret that should he lose to Real Madrid, he'd be sacked. Goals from Guillermo Amor and Julio Salinas saved his skin and prompted the death knell for the Vultures. Even though they had been severely disheartened by the PSV defeat, they at least had the chance to correct themselves as long as they had qualified for the European Cup. In an attempt to rebound from the aberration of the previous season's semi-final, Real came eye-wateringly close to completing the treble. They'd righted the wrongs against PSV, this time in the quarter-finals thanks to Martin Vázquez's extra time winner. All that did was spit them out against the greatest threat, Milan. Whilst PSV killed the Vulture spirit, the Milan team of Van Basten, Rijkaard and Gullit, governed by Sacchi, left them comatose. Many rightly decry the mere existence of Milan for the incapacity of this Real Madrid team to win the European Cup, and it's thanks to the landmark defeat suffered by Los Blancos in April 1989. After Marco van Basten had salvaged an away goal in the Bernabeu first leg, in a 1-1 draw, few could envision the evisceration that followed. Ancelotti, Rijkaard, Gullit, Van Basten, Donadoni, Milan 5, Madrid 0. Just as Milan's star players had conquered Europe with their national team at Euro '88, so too had they ran roughshod over the club game. Unlike PSV, there was to be no redemption arc for Real. They met in the subsequent season's last 16, but a 2-1 aggregate defeat put Real out of the European Cup before Christmas. From here, the semblance of the Vulture squad had dissipated. Hugo Sanchez struggled with injuries, Martin Vázquez was sold to Torino, and Real became an expensive collection of players thanks to the signings of Bernd Schuster and Gheorghe Hagi, as opposed to a team. A catastrophic 7-week period that saw 8 defeats killed off Real's season on 3 fronts. First out in the Copa del Rey last 16 to Atletico Madrid, then 3-1 losers to Spartak Moscow in the European Cup quarter-final before 3 La Liga, defeats in 4 to the lowly trio of Logroñés, Burgos and Espanyol, ended their campaign as a contest. That season was Barcelona's time. Real had spun through a revolving door of managers initiated by John Toshak's November sacking before Alfredo Di Stefano returned and was culled in favour of Rade Antic in March. The result was 3rd place and, more horrifically, Barcelona's eloping to the title and qualification for the European Cup. With one ferocious strike from Ronald Koeman's boot, Johan Cruyff's legacy was solidified, whilst the story of the Vulture squad faded gradually from view. Cruyff was the one who fostered an academy that became world-renowned, yet he wasn't the first to do so. Real Madrid had created the same energy, a domestic dominance that stretched beyond that of what Barcelona would ever be capable of. Yet they didn't win the biggest prize that both Cruyff's Barcelona and Guardiola's Barcelona would do so. Only Real's vintage between 1961 and 1965 could boast 5 Liga titles in a row. Whilst they didn't have the volume of academy graduates, they could lean on European Cups. Barcelona's philosophical rise that began with Cruyff was a meticulously planned affair, yet a decade prior, Real Madrid had performed the same duties, but with a dash of spontaneity. Ultimately, whilst they reached the pinnacle of Spanish football, they didn't reach the absolute one pinnacle that all Real Madrid teams are judged by. Hence, whilst they are remembered within Madrid, they take a back seat for some of the lesser vintages of the club. Only when Cruyff was spectacularly binned after defeat in the Copa del Rey final of 1996 at the hands of Atletico Madrid could Real Madrid tiptoe out from underneath their shadow, at least in the duopoly of El Clásico. Less so, it proved, in the inspirations that Cruyff's time in Barcelona demanded. He fast-tracked the graduation not only of Pep Guardiola, who would become the modern-day form of Cruyffian football, but also the system that birthed Guardiola himself, and allowed him to play with such toys as Xavi, Iniesta, Busquets, and Messi. And alongside Guardiola, in today's landscape sits Klopp, who was directly influenced by another of the Vulture squad's rivals, Arrigo Sacchi's Milan. Yet before the success of Guardiola, of Klopp, of Barcelona or Milan again on the European stage, there was the belated ending of the hunt for Real Madrid's 7th European Cup. It came 6 years after the competition was renamed, rebranded and reformatted, but it remained Los Blancos' 7th reign as European champion all the same. Lifting the famous trophy aloft in Amsterdam after a 1-0 win over Juventus was the last remaining member of the Vulture Squad, Manolo Sanchis, 3 days shy of his 33rd birthday. 2 years and 4 days later, fresh from the celebrations of his 35th birthday, Sanchis trotted out onto the Stade de France pitch 10 minutes from time. Real Madrid were winning a one-sided Champions League final against compatriots Valencia, and now was the time for Sanchis to soak up the adulation. Los Blancos had become European champions for the second time in 3 years, and for all the promise that the Vulture Squad had threatened in becoming a European superpower, at least one of their number had fulfilled such a promise. Sanchis would retire for good in 2001, having made his debut for Real Madrid in December 1983. He played 10 times for the senior team, a number only dwarfed by Raúl and Iker Casillas, teammates of his at the turn of the millennium, whom he passed the baton on to. They, of course, have since passed the baton on to another domineering team, and now Real Madrid have been champions of Europe 14 times, double the amount since a member of the Vulture Squad got a touch of the European Cup.